Every intellectual today has some certificate of nationality, a native language, and a tradition. But, reading Julien Benda's well-known book, The Betrayal of the Intellectuals, one gets the impression that intellectuals exist in a sort of universal space, bound neither by national boundaries nor by ethnic identity. The book appeared in 1927, at a time when it clearly seemed to Benda that being interested in intellectuals meant being concerned only with Europeans, Jesus being the one non-European he talks about approvingly. Things have changed a great deal since then. In the first place, Europe and the West are no longer the unchallenged standard setters for the rest of the world. The dismantling of the great colonial empires after World War II diminished Europe's capacity for intellectually and politically irradiating what used to be called the dark places of the earth. With the advent of the Cold War, the emergence of the Third World, and the universal emancipation implied, if not enacted, by the presence of the United Nations, non-European nations and traditions now seemed worthy of serious attention. In the second place, the incredible speeding up both of travel and communication has made for a new awareness of what have been called difference and otherness. To speak of intellectuals today is thus to speak specifically of national, religious, and even continental variations on the topic, each one of which seems to require separate consideration. The African intellectuals, for instance, or the Arab intellectuals, are each of them set in a very particular historical development with its own problems, triumphs, and peculiarities. To some extent, this narrowing focus and localization in the way we look at intellectuals is also due to the fantastic proliferation of specialized studies, which have quite justifiably tracked the expanding role of intellectuals in modern life. Yet despite all this difference and otherness, despite the inevitable erosion in the universal concept of what it means to be an intellectual, some general notions about the individual intellectual, which is my concern here, do seem to have more than strictly local application. The first of these that I want to discuss is nationality, and with it, that hothouse development out of nationality, nationalism. Every individual intellectual is born into a language, and for the most part spends the rest of his or her life in that language, which is the principal medium of intellectual activity. Languages, of course, are always national: Greek, French, Arabic, English, German, and so forth. Although one of the main points I'm making here is that the intellectual is obliged to use a national language, not only for obvious reasons of convenience and familiarity, but also because he or she hopes to impress on the language a particular sound, a special accent, and finally a perspective that is one's own. The particular problem of the intellectual, however, is that there already exists a language community in each society that is dominated by habits of expression, one of whose main functions is to keep things going smoothly, unchanged, unchallenged. George Orwell talks about this very persuasively in his essay, Politics and the English Language. Clichés, tired metaphors, lazy writing, he says, are instances of the decay of language. The result is that the mind is numbed and remains inactive, while language that has the effect of background music in a supermarket washes over consciousness, lulling the mind into passive acceptance of unexamined ideas and sentiments. Orwell's concern in that essay, which was written in 1946, was the gradual encroachment on English minds of political demagogues. Political language, he says, and with variations this is true of all political parties from conservatives to anarchists, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. The problem is both larger and more ordinary than that, however, and can be illustrated by looking briefly at the way language today has of tending to more general, more collective and corporate forms. Take journalism as a case in point. In the United States, for instance, the bigger the scope and power of a newspaper, the more authoritative its sound, the more closely identified it is with a sense of a community larger than just a group of professional writers and readers. The difference between a tabloid and the New York Times is that the Times aspires, and is generally considered to be, the national newspaper of record, its editorials reflecting not only the opinions of a few men and women, but supposedly also the perceived truth of and for the entire nation. In contrast, a tabloid is designed to capture immediate attention through sensational articles and startling typography. Any article in the New York Times carries with it a sober authority, suggesting long research, careful meditation, considered judgment. Editorial we's and us's refer directly to the editors themselves, of course, but they also hope to suggest a national corporate identity as in we the people of the United States. Journalism only clarifies and fixes what is normally implied in the very existence of a national language like English, that is, a national community, a national identity, or self. Matthew Arnold, the 19th century man of letters, went as far as saying that the state was the nation's best self, and a national culture the expression of the very best that had been said or thought. Far from self-evident, these best selves and best thoughts are, Arnold said, what men of culture, or intellectuals, are supposed to articulate and represent. Underlying Arnold's argument is a fear that in becoming more democratic, with more people demanding the right to vote and the right to do what they pleased, society was becoming more fractious, more difficult to govern. Hence the implied need for intellectuals to quiet people down, to show them the best ideas and the best works of literature as a way of feeling themselves to be integrated into a national community. That was during the 1860s. To Benda, writing in 1927, intellectuals were in danger of succeeding too well, for in showing the French how great French science and literature were, they were also teaching citizens that to belong to a national community was an end in itself, especially if that community was a great nation like France. Instead, Benda proposed that intellectuals should stop thinking in terms of collective passions and should concentrate instead on transcendental values, those that were universally applicable to all nations and peoples. As I said a moment ago, Benda took it for granted that these values were European and not Indian or Chinese. As for the kind of intellectuals he approved of, they too were European men. There seems to be no way of escaping the frontiers and enclosures built around us, either by nations or by other kinds of communities, like Europe, Africa, the West, or Asia, that share a common language and a whole set of implied and shared characteristics. Nothing is more common in public discourse than phrases like the English, or the Arabs, or the Americans, or the Africans, each of them suggesting not only a whole culture, but a specific mindset. It is very much the case today that in dealing with the Islamic world, all 1 billion people in it, with dozens of different societies, half a dozen major languages, including Arabic, Turkish, Iranian, all of them spread out over about a third of the globe, American or British academic intellectuals speak reductively, and in my view irresponsibly, of something called Islam. They talk as if Islam was a simple object about which grand generalizations spanning a millennium and a half of Muslim history could be made, and about which judgments concerning the compatibility between Islam and democracy, Islam and human rights, Islam and progress, could quite unabashedly be advanced. Were these discussions simply the learned theories of individual scholars looking, like George Eliot's Mr. Casaubon, for a key to all mythologies, one could dismiss them as so much occult dithering. But they take place in the post-Cold War context, provided by the United States' domination of the Western Alliance, in which a consensus has emerged about resurgent or fundamentalist Islam being the new threat that has replaced communism. Here, corporate thinking has not made intellectuals into the questioning and skeptical individual minds about which I've been speaking, but rather into a chorus that echoes the prevailing policy view, hastening it along into more corporate thinking and into a gradually more and more irrational sense that we are being threatened by them. All this is part of maintaining a national identity. To feel, for example, that the Russians are coming, or that the Japanese economic invasion is upon us, or that militant Islam is on the march, is not only to experience collective alarm, but also to consolidate our identity as beleaguered and at risk. How to deal with this is, I submit, a major question for the intellectual today. Does the fact of nationality commit the individual intellectual, who is for my purposes here the center of attention, to the public mood for reasons of solidarity, primordial loyalty, or national patriotism? Or can a better case be made for the intellectual as a dissenter from the corporate ensemble? Never solidarity before criticism is the short answer. The intellectual always has a choice, either to side with the weaker, the less well represented, the forgotten or ignored, or to side with the more powerful. Here it is good to be reminded that national languages are themselves not merely out there sitting around for use, but must be appropriated for use. An American columnist writing during the Vietnam War, for example, using the words us and our, has appropriated neutral pronouns and affiliated them consciously either with that appalling invasion of a distant Southeast Asian nation or, a much more difficult alternative, with those lonely voices of dissent for whom the American war was both unwise and unjust. This does not mean opposition for opposition's sake, but it does mean asking questions, making distinctions, restoring to memory all those things that tend to be overlooked or walked past in the rush to collective judgment and action. With regard to the consensus on group or national identity, it is the intellectual's task to show how the group is not a natural or God-given entity, but is a constructed, manufactured, even in some cases invented object, with a history of struggle and conquest behind it, that it is sometimes important to represent. One of the finest examples of this is to be found in Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own, a crucial text for the modern feminist intellectual. Asked to give a lecture on women and fiction, Woolf at the outset decides that to do so beyond stating her conclusion, that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she's to write fiction, she must make of the proposition a rational argument, and this in turn commits her to a process she describes as follows. One can only show how one came to hold whatever opinion one does hold. Exposing her argument, Woolf says, is an alternative to telling the truth directly, since where sex is concerned, controversy rather than debate is likely to ensue. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. Now, this is tactically disarming, of course, but it also involves personal risk. That combination of vulnerability and rational argument provides Woolf with a perfect opening through which she can enter her subject, not as a dogmatic voice providing the ultimate word on the subject, but as an intellectual representing the forgotten, weaker sex in a language perfectly suited for the job. Thus, the effect of A Room of One's Own is to separate out from the language and power of what Woolf calls patriarchy a new sensitivity to the place, both subordinate and usually not thought about but hidden, of women. Hence the splendid pages about the Jane Austen who hid her manuscript, or the subterranean anger affecting Charlotte Bronte, or, most impressive, on the relationship between male, that is dominant, and female, that is secondary and occluded values. When Woolf describes how it is that those male values are already set when a woman takes up her pen to write, she's also describing the relationship that obtains when the individual intellectual begins to write or speak. There's always a structure of power and influence, a massed history of already articulated values and ideas, and also, and most important for the intellectual, an underside to them. Ideas, values, people who, like the women writers that Woolf discusses, have not been given a room of their own. As the early 20th century German critic and philosopher Walter Benjamin said, "Whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which the present rulers step over those who are lying prostrate." This rather dramatic vision of history coincides with Gramsci's, for whom social reality itself is divided between rulers and those whom they rule. I think the major choice faced by the intellectual is whether to be allied with the stability of the victors and rulers, or, the more difficult path, to consider that stability as a state of emergency threatening the less fortunate, the experience of subordination itself, the memory of forgotten voices and persons, with the danger of complete extinction. As Benjamin says, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it was. It means to seize hold of a memory or a presence as it flashes up at a moment of danger. Now, one of the standard definitions of the modern intellectual, as provided by sociologist Edward Shills, says that the intellectual belongs to a small minority of persons who can get beyond immediate experience and represent their society's general symbols and values. Shills later adds to this that intellectuals can stand at two extremes. They're either against the prevailing norms, or in some basically accommodating way, they exist to provide order and continuity in public life. My opinion is that only the first of these two possibilities is truly the modern intellectual's role, that of disputing the prevailing norms. This is so exactly because, to return to what I began this lecture with, the dominant norms are today so intimately connected to the nation, which stands at the top and is always triumphalist, always in a position of authority, always exacting loyalty and subservience, rather than intellectual investigation and re-examination of the kind that both Woolf and Walter Benjamin speak about. Moreover, in many cultures today, intellectuals principally question, rather than communicate directly with, the general symbols Shills speaks about. There's been a shift, therefore, from patriotic consensus and acquiescence to skepticism and contest. For an American intellectual like Kirkpatrick Sale, the entire narrative of perfect discovery and unlimited opportunity which had guaranteed American exceptionalism in the establishment of a new republic is unacceptably flawed. Sale contends that the pillage and genocide which had destroyed the earlier state of affairs was too high a price to have paid. Traditions and values once held as sacred now therefore appear both hypocritical and racially based. And on many university campuses in America, the debate about the canon of great books, for all its sometimes idiotic stridency or fatuous smugness, reveals a much more unstable intellectual attitude towards national symbols, hallowed traditions, and nobly unassailable ideas. I think this is certainly as true in countries like the United States, Britain, France, Germany, where recently the very idea of national identity has been openly contested for its insufficiencies, not just by intellectuals, but by an urgent demographic reality. There are now immigrant communities in Europe from the former colonial territories to whom the ideas of France and Britain and Germany, as constituted during the period between 1800 and 1950, simply excludes them. In addition, newly invigorated feminist and gay movements in all these countries also contest the patriarchal and fundamentally masculine norms regulating society hitherto. In the United States, an expanding number of recently arrived immigrants, as well as a gradually more vocal and visible population of native people, have challenged the tradition that for 2 centuries has been derived from the New England Puritans and the Southern slave and plantation owners. These new voices are the forgotten Indians whose lands were expropriated and whose environment was either completely destroyed or totally transformed by the advancing republic, as well as those of women, African Americans, and sexual minorities. Responding to all this has been a resurgence of appeals to a tradition, to patriotism and basic or family values, as they've been called, all of them associated with a past that is no longer recoverable except by denying or somehow downgrading the lived experience of those who, in Aimé Césaire's great phrase, want a place at the rendezvous of victory. Even in a large number of countries of the Third World, a clamorous antagonism between the status quo powers of the national state and the disadvantaged populations locked inside, but unrepresented or suppressed by it, provides the intellectual with a real opportunity to resist the forward march of the victors. In the Arab-Islamic world, for instance, a still more complicated situation obtains. Countries like Egypt and Tunisia, which have long been ruled since independence by secular nationalist parties that have now degenerated into coteries and cliques, are suddenly rent by Islamic groups whose mandate, they say with considerable justice, is granted them by the oppressed, the urban poor, the landless peasants of the countryside, all those with no hope except a restored or reconstructed Islamic past. Many people are willing to fight to the death for these ideas. But Islam is the majority religion after all, and simply to say that Islam is the way, levelling most dissent and difference, to say nothing of widely divergent interpretations of Islam, is not, I believe, the intellectual's role. Islam, after all, is a religion and culture, both of them composite and very far from monolithic. Yet insofar as it is the faith and identity of the vast majority of people, it is by no means incumbent on the intellectual simply to go in for choruses praising Islam, but rather to introduce into the din, first of all, an interpretation of Islam stressing its complex and heterodox nature, and second, asking of Islamic authorities to face the challenges of non-Islamic minorities, women's rights, of modernity itself, with humane attentiveness and honest reappraisals, not dogmatic or pseudo-populist chants. The nub of this for the intellectual in Islam is a revival of ijtihad, personal interpretation, and not a sheep-like abdication to politically ambitious ulama or charismatic demagogues. Always, however, the intellectual is beset and remorselessly challenged by the problem of loyalty. All of us, without exception, belong to some sort of national, religious, or ethnic community. No one, no matter the volume of protestations, is above the organic ties that bind the individual to family, community, and, of course, nationality. For an emergent and beset group, say the Bosnians or the Palestinians today, feeling that your people are threatened with political and sometimes actual physical extinction, commits you to its defense, to doing everything within your power to protect or to fight against the national enemies. This is defensive nationalism, of course, yet as Frantz Fanon analysed the situation during the height of the Algerian War of Liberation against the French, going along with the approving chorus of Algerian nationalism as embodied in party and leadership is not enough. There's always the question of goal, which, even in the thick of battle, entails the analysis of choices. Are we fighting just to rid ourselves of colonialism, a necessary goal? Or are we thinking about what we will do when the last white policeman leaves? According to Fanon, the goal of the native intellectual cannot simply be to replace a white policeman with his native counterpart, but rather what he called, borrowing from Aimé Césaire, the invention of new souls. Even among the oppressed, there are also victors and losers. And the intellectual's loyalty must not be restricted only to joining the collective march. Great intellectuals like Tagore of India or José Martí of Cuba were exemplary in this regard, never abating their criticism because of nationalism, even though they remained nationalists themselves. In no country more than modern Japan has the interplay between the imperatives of the collective and the problem of intellectual alignment with it been so tragically problematic and vexed. With the Meiji Restoration of 1868 that brought back the emperor, and the abolition of feudalism shortly thereafter, a deliberate course of building a new composite ideology was set upon, with results in fascist militarism and national perdition that culminated in the defeat of Imperial Japan in 1945. The Tennosei Ideologie, the emperor ideology, was the creation of intellectuals during the Meiji period. And while it was originally nurtured by a sense of national defensiveness, even inferiority, in 1915 it had become a fully fledged nationalism capable simultaneously of extreme militarism, veneration of the emperor, and a sort of nativism that subordinated the individual to the state. It also denigrated other races to such an extent as to permit the willful slaughter of Chinese in the 1930s, for example, in the name of Shido Menziku, the idea that the Japanese were the leading race. Thereafter, one of the most shameful episodes in the modern history of intellectuals took place during World War II, when, as the American historian John Dower has described it, Japanese and American intellectuals joined the battle of national and racial name-calling on an offensive and ultimately debasing scale. After the war, most Japanese intellectuals, according to the Japanese-American critic Masao Miyoshi, were convinced that the essence of their new mission was not just the dismantling of Tennosei or corporate ideology, but the construction of a liberal individualist subjectivity, Shutaisei, meant to compete with the West, but alas doomed, Miyoshi says, to the ultimate consumerist vacuity in which the act of buying alone serves as the confirmation and reassurance of individual beings. Miyoshi reminds us, however, that post-war intellectual attention given to the matter of subjectivity also included giving voice to questions of responsibility for the war, as in the works of the writer Maruyama Masao, who spoke effectively of an intellectual community of penitents. In dark times, an intellectual is very often looked to by members of his or her nationality to represent, speak out for, and testify to the sufferings of that nationality. Prominent intellectuals always are, to use Oscar Wilde's description of himself, in symbolic relationship with their time. In the public consciousness they represent achievement, fame, and reputation, which can be mobilized on behalf of an ongoing struggle or embattled community. Inversely, prominent intellectuals are very often made to bear the brunt of their community's opprobrium. This occurs either when factions within it associate the intellectual with the wrong side. This has been quite common in Ireland, for instance, but also in Western metropolitan centres during the Cold War years, when pro- and anti-communists traded blows, or when other groups mobilized for an attack. Certainly Wilde felt himself to be suffering the guilt of all avant-garde thinkers who had dared to challenge the norms of middle-class society. In our own time, a man like Elie Wiesel has come to symbolize the sufferings of the 6 million Jews who were exterminated in the Nazi Holocaust. To this terribly important task of representing the collective suffering of your own people, testifying to its travails, reasserting its enduring presence, reinforcing its memory, there must be added something else, which only an intellectual, I believe, has the obligation to fulfill. After all, many novelists, painters, and poets like Manzoni, Picasso, or Neruda have embodied the historical experience of their people in aesthetic works, which in turn become recognized as great masterpieces on their own of that experience. For the intellectual, the task, I believe, is explicitly to universalize the crisis, to give greater human scope to what a particular race or nation suffered, to associate that experience with the sufferings of others. It is inadequate only to affirm that a people was dispossessed, was oppressed or slaughtered, was denied its rights and its political existence, without at the same time doing what Fanon did during the Algerian War, affiliating those horrors with the similar afflictions of other people. This does not at all mean a loss in historical specificity, but rather it guards against the possibility that a lesson learned about oppression in one place will be forgotten or violated in another place or time. And just because you represent the sufferings that your people lived through, which you yourself might have lived through also, you are not relieved of the duty of revealing that your own people now may be visiting related crimes on their victims. The South African Boers, for instance, have seen themselves as the victims of British imperialism. But this meant that after surviving British aggression during the Boer War, the Boers, as a community represented by Daniel Francois Malan, were entitled to an assertion of their historical experience by setting up in the doctrines of the National Party what became apartheid. It is rarely easier and more popular for intellectuals than to fall into modes of vindication and self-righteousness that blind them to the evil done in the name of their own ethnic or national community. This is particularly true during periods of emergency and crisis, when rallying to the flag, for instance during the Falklands or Vietnamese wars, meant that debate on the justice of a war was construed as the equivalent of treason. But though nothing can make you more unpopular, an intellectual must, in such situations, overcome the natural tendency to hesitation and speak out against the general chorus.